All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to week 2 of the Corporate Entrepreneurship Forum. Before we get into the first session today, I did want to, as I've been doing at the beginning of every day, just thank our sponsors. I've said this a lot of times at this point, but it's really true and it bears repeating. We could not do this without our sponsors. And so a big thank you to Optum, to Philips, and to Linode. The three of them really made all of this possible. We're going to start today with an update on something that if you were at the forum last year, you saw the beginning of this. So remember, the Kauffman Foundation a number of years ago had this research report that came out talking about all net new jobs come from the gazelles. And one of the things that we've been looking at the Corporate Startup Lab is that while we believe that's true, we also believe a lot of those gazelles live inside bigger companies. And so we've been trying to take a more holistic look at the overall regional innovation ecosystem. And Lou and Kevin are going to kind of start walking through that. I'm going to hand it over to Lou, and then he'll introduce Kevin as well. And then we're going to also build on that this year, not just talking about what's going on in Pittsburgh, but a group that I've been personally just incredibly impressed with. I've gotten to know them both in my day job capacity as a venture capitalist and in my role at Carnegie Mellon, called Centrifuge, which is a really interesting model in Cincinnati. And so they're going to share a little bit about what's working there as we talk about these regional innovation ecosystems. But Lou, I'll hand it over to you to get us started today.
Thank you, Sean. And I want to say hats off for last week's program. And it looks like this week's program is awesome too. So hats off. Over the next 25 minutes, we really want to try to accomplish 3 things with all of you relative to better understanding the job dynamics of what we're calling regional innovation ecosystems. First thing is, as Sean mentioned, Dr. Stolarick is just going to update you on our research and progress on these regional innovation systems and the job decomposition model that he presented last year. Kevin's a Tepper alumni and refers to this as decomposition modeling. Second, we're going to drill into another regional innovation ecosystem. You see that nice face on the screen, Eric Weissman. It's similar to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Ohio. And he's going to talk to us about Centrifuge's startup and entrepreneurial community. And Eric's going to help us focus a little bit on their corporate sector and how they're able to really engage the Krogers and the P&Gs of the world. And then we want to set the stage for 2021 and a deeper dive we're going to do into this decomposition model and regional IT ecosystems. Second, I want to thank Carnegie Mellon and the Swartz Center, specifically Dave Mawhinney and Hallie Johnson for their help in this. And of course, Sean for his support on the research design and some of the funding behind this. So I mentioned our chief data scientist, Kevin Stolarick. I think a newspaper one time, maybe it was USA Today, called Kevin the official statistician of what Peter Drucker would call the knowledge economy, but others call the creative economy. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks.
Kevin, last year you shared this 3-part model of a regional IT sector. Refresh us on how you define the IT sector from a jobs perspective. As there's so many ways people define this sector.
So the big thing, I think, is that we were trying to be inclusive. One of the kind of statistics I often cite, in fact, I was on a call very early this morning with India, and I was citing these same numbers with them. But in talking about the fact that half the people who work in IT don't do IT work, in the IT industry don't do IT work, and over half the people that do IT work aren't in the IT industry. So we knew that, we wanted to look at just kind of a sample industry or sector. And so we said, well, in IT and kind of innovation technology in general, we included robotics in there. We included other things, but we made a little bit more extensive than many others. Gartner, who has probably one of the most extensive definitions for IT, still doesn't include some of even what we did. And so we really were looking at hardware and software and services. And then we also included, we kind of went back on the supply chain a little bit and also looked at some of the kind of retail and related stuff that would get categorized as retail, wholesale, and some of that. So it was a very broad look across the entire sector to get a better handle of it, so that we could get a better sense of what was going on.
Excellent, excellent. So hardware, software, services, and retail pulling in that channel, almost like more Michael Porterish, I'm hearing.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Let me ask you this. What was the sample? What was the data source you pulled together for this?
So when we talked about this last year, I know we've referenced it without really describing it. It's worth kind of quickly. The whole idea behind this is really looking at, we can understand change across the region year to year. That's easily done. There's a lot of, I work with all the kind of census and BLS data and all that stuff to be able to see how it's changing. But to really be able to decompose it or to break the change up to understand what the various components are. So, and what we're really interested in, as Sean said, it's getting a handle on what's happening kind of on the corporate side, right? And so, and how do you look at corporate, and how do you look at what's startup, and how do you think about the kind of still the small, the SMEs, right? The small and medium-sized enterprises, but that are more established. They're not startups anymore, but they're not big. And so we really want to look at that. And what we found was the D&B Hoover's data, which is out there, and primarily, I mean, it's for reporting on, it's credit worthiness and stuff. I mean, but it's also marketing lists, right? I mean, they maintain, right? They sell this stuff. And there was somebody that we've done some work with in the past who had access to it and had a good relationship with them to work with them. And we were able to kind of take our expansive definition and use the D&B data to really get information on all of the firms in the IT sector in the Pittsburgh region, which is what we were looking at.
Okay. So you have this startup sub part of the ecosystem we know a good bit about, this corporate sector, and then this sector in the middle. So you were able to tease out all three of those, which is interesting. So a three-part model. So I have to ask you this. We've been together a long time. Eric's seen this a lot, I'm sure. There's jobs research everywhere. So what's really different about this?
Oh, well, the big thing, as I said, was the being able to do the decomposition, right? So being able to take the data that we had, because you don't have, being able to look at, for instance, at vintage, when was the company established, right? I mean, to know who's the start, just because you're under 500 or you're under 250 or under 100 employees, that makes you small, depending on your industry. But you don't know how, it doesn't mean you're a startup, right? We don't know how long you've been around. So being able to actually understand how long companies have been around, as well as how big they are, as well as more specifics about what subsector because we're only looking at IT, of the IT sector that they were in, of being able to do that. So really, it's about being able to do the decomposition, right? I know the net change, with across the region year to year, but I really want to be able to look at it and say, well, there's a lot of different things going on for that net change. And what are some of those things? And can we look at them and identify them and get a better sense of what's going on?
And I know when we talked to Dave Morning, to people to Swartz Center, and then we talked with Bob Starzinski and Innovation Works, and then I think Sean Luther, the people at Innovate Pittsburgh, we broadened the definition of a startup, or we looked at, how did we look at a startup? Maybe I'll ask you that.
Well, it's three things, right? So startup is anybody who started within the past 5 years.
Okay.
And that was it was like, no, we're going to be clear about it. Just if you have a start date and it was within the past 5 years, it doesn't matter how big you are, right? Which is actually interesting as well, because you do get, right, sometimes you can get firms that actually, the gazelles, right, as Sean mentioned, right, if they hit their bend in the hockey stick within a 5-year period, they can suddenly become big, which is what you want, but they're still a startup, right? I mean, they still started within the past 5 years. And so using that kind of, again, being able to look at the vintage of the company, so using that as a definition for startup. Then if you haven't started within the past 5 years, then how many employees do you have? Right. We used a 250 cutoff. Sometimes it's a 500. Sometimes it's a 250. It didn't change things. I mean, the results are almost identical. There's just a few firms that shifted, but we thought, well, 250 actually seemed like a slightly better number. So if you have fewer than 250 employees, then you're a small and medium-sized enterprise. Now you're older because you're not a startup anymore, but you're still a small and medium-sized enterprise. And then if you have more than 250 or more, or if you have a corporate parent that isn't in Pennsylvania, right? The nice part about the D&B data was it actually has a lot of corporate structure stuff, right? And so they actually identify, look, here's this firm that's in the region, but this firm actually has a parent company, and that parent company's headquarters is in New Jersey, in New York, in London, wherever, right? And so they actually track that down and identify the kind of corporate trees, right, and all that structure. So what it meant was that we were able to understand that there was a significant number of firms that actually are corporate. They have a corporate ownership structure. They're owned by somebody, and there's a lot of examples of this that come up in Pittsburgh, right? Of firms that are, oh well, yeah, but really it's owned by Uber, it's owned by Ford, it's owned by Alphabet, or you get small firms that get acquired and things, through acquisition and stuff like that, and so. Or it's just a small establishment within the region, but it's part of a much larger company. And so being able to look at all of those was really important.
So that's a great segue into my next to last question, which is, wow. So what are some of the things you're learning? I think one of the things I saw in one of your notes or something was a significant portion of this corporate, this third part of the ecosystem are not people headquartered in our home state in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Yeah, well, yeah, a very large number actually, right? Between actually over 95% of all the firms that we identified as corporate have a non-Pennsylvania parent, right? So so here's the kind of, we looked the past few years, right? And using those the standard definitions just for the overall IT sector, as I said, and I have a breakdown on the next slide, but the vast majority of the numbers of firms, right, are these established small firms, right? Huge numbers there in terms of number of firms. You see a lot of startups and a growing number of startups across the region in the past few years. Corporate is then the kind of corporate owned and corporate firms themselves have been very steady. Has not really increased or decreased in terms of the numbers, right? What has been happening, though, is that the employment has been decreasing. But corporate still makes up over half the total employment in the IT sector is through these corporate firms, right? This is not, again, and the startups, what's interesting, even if you look at startups, is that you see that kind of blue line in the middle is startups, right? While the number of startups has increased, the actual total employment has stayed fairly stable. Over the past several years, right? So the number of firms is going up, but the average size of firms is going down. And then that gray section are those established firms, right? The ones that have been around for 6 or more years, but are still under 250 employees, right?
So you have corporate core. You have this corporate core that looks like it's maybe 1 and 2 jobs. You got that fat middle market, and then you have these startups that are churning along. What I think I'm seeing here is the number of establishments are increasing, but it looks like the employees per establishment are decreasing. What's that mean? What are some of the thoughts behind that?
Well, and part of it is, I mean, there's additional decomposition that we can do with the data that we haven't done yet, haven't gotten to, been able to get to yet. But it is to understand, I mean, the average firm size is going down. Right, so firms are getting smaller now. Whether it's a right sizing argument, whether it's the other right, so the number of firms is staying pretty stable, but the average number of employees in IT, right, is going down. In IT firms is going down, right? So not for startups and not so much for the middle market, right? It's really just on the corporate side. So whether it is from firms again getting smaller, or if it's a shift, also part of it. As you'll see, the other thing was looking at breaking up right into subsectors, right? So this is the numbers just from 2020, and I will say D&B reports the numbers for 2020. A lot of the numbers that they report, it comes from tax filings because that's the tax information, I should say. It's not that they don't get the IRS data, but so a lot of this stuff. So the 2020 numbers get updated in March, right? In the March-April timeframe, and so they always maintain an active database, right? So the 2020 numbers. So a lot of the 2020 numbers even are for 2019 because that's when the tax reporting was being done. So it doesn't include a lot of stuff for COVID, but it shows you, and it's the full IT sector across Pittsburgh, right? D&B has full data for that. So it's not that we're missing a few months worth of data yet, which could be additional updates, but anyway, it's for full results. So this is the most recent stuff, which actually, I mean, again, one of the additional advantages of the using the DMB data for this is that in addition to it being more comprehensive and more detailed than what we can get from government sources, it's also more timely. So it takes advantage of that as well. But you see, as you break it down, the number of, based on the kind of, at the subsector, as well as whether it's a corporate startup or established company, the number of employees per company shifts, right, across the subsectors. So part of this result on the overall can also be just a shift across the different sectors. Right. So it could be that individual companies are getting smaller. It could just be that the numbers across it, and we have all of the data, but as I said, to take through it all, but to see whether or not the numbers themselves are, if it's the shift, smaller, the kind of more smaller companies, fewer bigger ones across different sectors and things like that. So part of what we want to be able to do with this analysis, right, by being able to break this up and looking at it in this way, it gives us the opportunity to dig deeper into some of what's going on.
Okay. So I know when we look at what's next, we're going to try to drill down into these subsectors, this 4-part model. I know one of the things, and I want to shift over to Eric to hear the story from Centrifuge, but I think when we looked at the average number of employees per establishment, I think for startups over the 5-year period it was 3. For the middle market it was 7. But when we looked at the corporate, it was something like 55 employees per establishment. And I think when I think about being able to impact the regional economy, this concept that Sean and Kaufman have started with the Gazelles, I think I'll look forward to learning more from you on that next year. So let me transition and think about this 3-part model, startups and the middle market companies, heavy IT service companies, the corporate sector, in another region that's very similar to ours, lovely Cincinnati, Ohio. I want to introduce Eric Weissman to the group. He's from Centrifuge in Cincinnati. They've been at this a while and have had some interesting observations with their corporate sector and what they're doing. So, Eric, can you tell us the story?
Yes, of course. Thank you. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I had a good chance and opportunity to be around the Pittsburgh ecosystem a few years ago, and obviously stay in touch to our peer cities that are around, concentric circles of Cincinnati. So it's good to cross-pollinate and share best practices. So thanks for inviting me to speak. I'll go over a little bit of the origin story of Centrifuge for those of you that don't know or just kind of want to hear in a concise fashion of what we do and what our mission is and some lessons that we've learned. And I think that, from a Pittsburgh standpoint, there's plenty to lean on and grow from as well. So I've been with Centrifuge for about 7.5 years, a part of the founding team. I like to say I was here when we were making things up. We're still making things up, but Centrifuge was started. A lot of people ask me, how did you get the big co's involved, the large global corporations that call Cincinnati home? How did you get them to be engaged? And the answer was it was their idea. So way back when, probably about 10 years from now, is when the initial seeds for Centrifuge were planted by a group called the Cincinnati Business Committee. And every city has a corresponding group of the CEOs of the top 30 companies in town. I refer to them as like the horizon-looking group. That there's somebody that's always looking for what should Cincinnati be doing, where should we be focusing. They're ever present, no matter who's the mayor or who's on city council. Procter and Gamble will always be headquartered in Cincinnati. So this group, the CBC, got together. And 2 seminal things had happened that really got their attention from an economic development standpoint. One, our airport lost its hub status. So Delta pulled out. That was a big wake-up call for everybody. That was thousands of flights, tens of thousands of visitors, thousands of jobs, just almost instantly overnight. So that was cause for alarm. And the second thing that happened in quick succession was that Chiquita pulled out. So Chiquita, a Fortune 500 company, we lost their global headquarters. They would go down to North Carolina and eventually leave the entire country. I think they're like Columbia or something like that is where they're headquartered now. But this was something that was troublesome for for a group like Cincinnati that have these big organizations that no matter the size that you are, and I'm not picking on Great American or Kroger or Fifth Third Bank, but you get rid of as many people a year as you hire, right? Once you get to be a certain size, you're just kind of treading water. So that's not good for a town that's got all of these Fortune 500 companies and imagine that downward pressure of activist shareholders that are incentivizing you to get rid of middle management layers and cutbacks and things like that. So this was a head scratcher for this CBC. So they commissioned the McKinsey Group to do a study on our innovation ecosystem, which is kind of like paying somebody $300,000 to tell you your baby is ugly, which we already knew, but that's what we do here in town. So they paid the McKinsey Group. They came in and discovered a bunch of things, but I'll just boil that down into three big categories. One, for a city of our size, we should be getting more capital from the outside. So we need to find a way to get more people investing inside Cincinnati. If you want to grow, you can't keep asking the same 5 people for money. Second thing was you got a lot of nodes in your ecosystem. There's an accelerator here, a university there, a co-working space over here, but everybody's kind of playing their own notes. It's not making a song. You need a conductor of the orchestra or a lifeguard in the pool, somebody to get all this stuff together. And then the third thing, there was no center of gravity. There was no belly button. There was no one physical place where everybody from out of town came to get connected, and the people in town came to get connected to people from out of town. So Centrifuge was built to work against that strategy. So I'm calling you from Union Hall. That's the center of gravity. That's a 38,000 square foot co-working space that we operate. We created a brand around the ecosystem called Startup Cincy, which gives an umbrella for everybody to rally underneath and a rallying cry for a lowest common denominator that everybody can agree on, that if this happens, that will be success for everyone else. But the strategic centerpiece of our strategy is our fund. And it's a fund of funds. So we don't make investments directly in startups. We invest in other funds throughout the country. We're into our second fund right now. Each fund, Fund 1 and 2, we're about $57 million. So about $115 million in assets under management. And what that's caused is deep engagement for these gigantic global corporations. Even though Centrifuge is operates as a nonprofit entity, this is a for-profit fund. So this was not just community benefit that they were looking at from a dollar standpoint. The first thing that they want out of the fund is their money back, right? It's return on investment. You give me $5 million, I'm going to try to get you $7 back. So this is a balance sheet instrument for them. But the second thing that our LPs, he or she who writes us the checks, the second thing that they want is front row seats to the freak show, right? They want to see curated access to startups. They want to see cool things that even they aren't seeing with innovation arms all over the country and all over the world, really, when you think of some of our more engaged partners. And then the third benefit is it does help out their community. Now that we've done diligence on hundreds of VC firms and been introduced to thousands of startups that now know where Ohio is on a map. Right? They know we're smack dab in the middle of the country. They know that our airport is in Kentucky, and they know that the big cos are engaged, that we've got a symbiotic relationship, an introduction and a working with startups and big cos, that it's not so much work like a startup. I know there's a lot of agencies and consultancies out there that help big cos work like a startup. We're work with a startup. So I think that's the big difference that we see here in Cincinnati. And over the course of the past few years, we've made some fits and starts, but done a pretty good job of getting those the big cos out of their own way and into the mix and talking and interacting with startups from all over the country, really. So I don't know if there's any. Oh, Lou, you're coming back. Anything else that you wanted me to double click on?
I I think you're on a roll. I like what I'm hearing. You help me understand the corporate ecosystem, the drivers behind them. As you know,
Mhm.
Pittsburgh was a hub also. Kevin, any thoughts or questions for Eric? Anything you'd like to build on?
I'm just watching the clock run down on us. Um,
We have another 5 minutes. That's a long.
all kinds of time, I know. I mean, no, I mean, as I said, I mean, I think it's an interesting model, and as we've been talking about, it's trying to understand kind of how to engage and understand what's going
Yeah.
on the corporate side, right? That becomes so important, and a large part of what what Sean and CSL are trying to do, right? So, I think that helping to anything that helps kind of bring some attention and focus to that, because it's so easy for it to not just
And a
kind of
lot
get
of
ignored.
those things need to be both sides of the table, right? Because we deal with the startups who say, man, if Rodney McMullen only saw my idea at Kroger, he's the CEO of Kroger. If they only saw my idea, that's when I'm going to go, in the unicorn status. And we're coming from the standpoint of that's not on Kroger's roadmap, right? Because they're looking at us to filter through some of that. So we try to encourage, from a startup standpoint, to focus on pillars, to focus on supply chain, for instance, to focus on fintech, that which our ecosystem has a right to win and is strong at. That will then therefore increase your odds of success. If you can match up with what Kroger is actually, wants to invest in, not just dollar wise, but invest in from a technology standpoint, why wouldn't you want to do that instead of trying to convince them to shift gears into your shiny new widget?
Okay.
But at the end of the day, Centrifuge is an economic development engine. So it really depends on a lot of that data. And I'd love to talk to you after this, if we can, about, you talked about where you pull your information on, but that's our measure for success. It's not going to be on, Kroger's. Of course, we want them to be profitable and want them to be a successful company, but is the entire pool growing? Are we bringing jobs in? Are we bringing not just tech jobs, but food truck jobs and baristas and all the things that, the things that startup employees want are the things that big co-employees want. So at the end of the day, we're an economic development driver, and we partner with our folks at the city of Cincinnati and other economic development agencies throughout the region to help grow that by fostering entrepreneurship.
Yeah. We have another minute and a half. I was going to throw one more question, Derek, and then Kevin, I want to thank you for helping us out today also. And I know we'll see you next year as we update on this project. But you talked about the belly button and having that center of gravity. What's the relationship with the universities? How involved are they? When you talk about bringing money in from the outside, how much is from local ideas and startups versus outside the region startups?
I would say the universities are very engaged. In my estimation, startups need three things: talent, customers, and money. The first is customers. Without a customer, you don't have a business. But very quickly behind that is talent, right? You need to have the right team. And we're blessed with four major universities here: University of Cincinnati, Xavier University, Northern Kentucky University, and Miami University. So we leverage them and they leverage us to continue to work out of here. Miami hosts three courses are taught here at Union Hall. So I would say I give us high marks on university relationship.
Excellent. Look, I appreciate both of you working with me. Time's always our enemy, especially when there's two really great stories together. Eric, we look forward to working with you and sharing some of this research. So, CSL is really thinking globally, but acting locally, and you're right in our backyard.
Yeah, it'd be great. We'll do something.
Okay. And everybody else, enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.